Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.
CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw, coming to you from the CHEK News World Headquarters here in Victoria. Break week this past week at the legislature, but not a break week from political developments. You have the government rocked by some blowback over the Premier's advisor to the downtown east side. There's continued controversy over Bill 15, and the Premier went to Yellowknife for the Western Premier's Conference, where we had some pipeline politics rear its head again. We are going to break all that down by bringing in the pod squad. You know them each and every week. Jeff Ferrier, Jillian Oliver, and Allie Blades are here. Thank you. And let us begin with the launch pad implosion of Michael Bryant, the Premier's handpicked special advisor for the downtown east side. We didn't know he had been hired until just over a week ago when Global News broke that story that he was 3 months into a 6-month, $150,000 government contract to study the downtown east side and report some solutions to government. After it came out, lasted a week or so, and then Tuesday, Premier David Eby pulled the plug, canceling the contract, saying it had become a distraction. So, Allie, let's begin with you on that. What do we make of the issue of the Premier hiring a downtown east side advisor, how it came out, and then what kind of felt maybe inevitable, but maybe tell us how you think it played out.
Well, it's interesting because the Premier said that he didn't mean to keep it a secret. And it wasn't a dirty little secret that he was keeping in this big contract and whatnot, and that eventually, it would have gotten out there. But I don't think that math adds up, because this is a Premier that has traditionally been very transparent and in saying these are all of the things that I'm doing. And so proactively, it would have been a really good thing for him to say, this is how I'm taking action on the issues for the downtown east side, but they didn't do that. So any claim that this was never intended to be a deep, dark secret is, I think, a line in because he got caught. And the other aspect of this that I just find so baffling is when the ministers that were sent out in response to this in the media, they kept saying, well, he's responsible for engaging stakeholders and developing a report and reading all of the reports because end lists have already been created about this issue. And I'm like, isn't this your job? You already get paid to do this, and you get paid a lot of money to do this. Isn't this technically what you're supposed to do? So now we've hired this other guy to do it. And so I think that was a little ridiculous to try to convince taxpayers that this was just par for the course. And so this whole thing, absolutely ridiculous. And all of that money already spent, we're not going to get a report. And then it also just speaks to the fact that it just seems that the trend of this NDP government, specifically with David Eby, is that the execution of things it's not really going his way. I think we're going to get into that with a couple of other things today, but he just can't catch a break when it comes to successfully telling voters in BC, hey, I'm doing a good job here, and starting things off right. It's always a bit of a fumble.
Mm-hmm. If we take Jeff, the Premier, at his word that the intention was to announce this, would that have made a difference, do you think? Michael Bryant announced 3 months ago that he's going to get this amount of money because there's a lot of other things that seem to quickly pile up, some of his history, the amount of money, the lack of engagement by some of the validators in the downtown east side that were not consulted. Would it have made a difference, do you think, if we'd known about this 3 months ago, or what do you think?
I think there'll be opposition blowback to pretty much any decision the government makes. I think it would have made a difference to a certain extent. I had the opportunity to work across the aisle when Michael Bryant was in the Ontario legislature. Was a very able attorney general, whip smart, set some big challenges in his life. These are well documented, and he's come back from those, and is someone who can make a difference, and could have been the case in the downtown east side. But look, the provincial government made a misstep here in how it handled the appointment. Premier Eby has acknowledged that. He's corrected course. The contract has been canceled. And to a certain extent, that's what effective leadership can look like. John Horgan did it with the Royal BC Museum. Remember, Christy Clark did it with yoga on the bridge. And that, to a certain extent, is how leaders are judged. But the broader lesson, and this is right to your point, is clear. Appointment to public roles need to be transparent, defensible, and credible, especially when the appointee is tasked with advising on really sensitive issues like downtown east side. And I think that's a lesson that the government's going to need to take as they appoint people to other similar roles going forward.
Jillian, it feels like, it's just my take here, that whoever, even if this had been public at the beginning, whoever would have got this job was stuck in kind of a hole, because it had been 2 years since Eby himself had stood with the mayor and the chief and Vancouver police chief and said, I'm going to take over the downtown east side. I'm going to take ownership of it. I'm going to help solve the problem. 2 years go by, nothing's happened. Suddenly some outsider gets given the gig to come in and figure things out. That's a really tough job to get, let alone the whole secrecy kind of angle to it.
Yeah, it is kind of surprising that we kind of see a pattern here with politicians coming in and kind of saying that they're going to fix the downtown east side. It reminds me a bit of Gregor Robertson saying he's going to fix homelessness, and that obviously didn't happen. I don't know where that impulse comes from, because I think it's pretty obvious if you worked in politics that the downtown east side is the culmination of a lot of very big social and economic problems that are definitely national, but maybe even at this point, global in scale. And so, yeah, again, I think to have one consultant come in and expect them to be able to be a silver bullet, I think is pretty absurd.
Mm-hmm. And I, having read his contract, and full credit for government for putting it out, he doesn't have to write a report. There is no report required as part of this money. He just gives verbal advice to and documents if he wants to cabinet committees. There's no public report that we're all going to read about how to solve the downtown east, which I think is part of the problem of it. And then it felt like when you have the city and the police department, the Portland Hotel Society, and big groups coming out and saying halfway through, we haven't even met with this guy. We haven't even submitted our ideas to him. How can you be grasping the situation without those groups involved? And then there was some sort of controversy raised in the legislature about Bryant's department from Legal Aid BC, which is a Crown corporation, and a sort of odd unwillingness or disinterest from the Premier to figure out what happened at the last Crown corporation taxpayer job before this one was given. And that seemed a little weird too. So there's a lot of angles that I think brought this down. And now who's going to fix the downtown east side? I guess it's back on the Premier's plate. He's going to have to do that.
I don't think it was the mandate of Mr. Bryant to fix the downtown east side. I think his mandate was to be resourced by government to go in and to help identify gaps and areas where there needed to be improvement, working with the people who are doing the work in the downtown east side, and those who suggest that government applying resources to try and identify those gaps brings some more stability to the community, recognizing that there is no silver bullet for it. This is the kind of thing you want government to do, and this was not rolled out effectively. And Allie makes the point about the implementation challenges the governments make, but I think we need to be clear that this was not a Michael Bryant fixes everything. It was a let's bring some focus to this issue and help folks on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm starting to think, though, that this might have been a fall guy situation, in that wouldn't it have been smart for the NDP government to not choose an elected person to take lead on this, rather an outside person, so that when 4 years from now, when we have when we're back in an election. Well, I tried, could be their response, but it's not any of our fault that nothing happened here. And so my conspiratorial hat is totally on now, and he was never meant to succeed.
Let's move on. We want to talk about another issue here as well. Premier David Eby attending the Western Premiers Conference in Yellowknife this week. Everyone emerging, the 7 provincial and territorial premiers emerging kind of with a united front at the closing press conference, saying they're all on the same page, except they have different priorities. And that led to questions to Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, sitting right beside David Eby, about pipelines, oil pipelines. She wants one, if not more, to the coast, wants the federal government to make it happen. And they tap danced around the issue of, or we're together, but with priorities, but we support each other, kind of. What's going to happen there in the next few weeks, do we think, when the premiers meet the prime minister? Jeff, we start talking more about this issue. Does BC have to say something about its position on a pipeline that is definitive, or does it just wait for events to kind of overtake it? Or what do you think the dynamics are here?
I think the dynamics are, well, first of all, Danielle Smith does have a pipeline to the West Coast. It's called Trans Mountain Expansion, and it just recently opened. And the cost implications of that, as it's owned by the federal government, have been, it was massive cost escalations. I think that if you're the BC government and you hear from the government in Alberta that there needs to be additional pipelines, I think you wait to weigh in when you have details about what that pipeline is, where the proposed route is, what the proposed usage is, where First Nations along the proposed route and at the endpoint, what their views on the issue is. And you have to work closely with the government of Canada. You have a prime minister who said that he potentially supports more pipelines, and as a pipeline crosses jurisdictions and reaches tidewater, those are all matters of federal jurisdiction. So it's a real tight wire that he's going to have to walk on. But I think the main thing that he needs to do is he just needs to avoid getting out in front of it and wait until the time is right. He understands all the dynamics, and then weigh in.
Yeah, Jillian, do you think it's possible for this government to get behind an oil pipeline if they craft some type of, Indigenous co-ownership deal, a revenue sharing, best route, best environmental protections? Like, if they could it be politically palatable in this climate for the NDP to support a pipeline, even though they've opposed that for many years now?
I mean, they have taken many different positions on fossil fuel development. In the end, they usually end up coming down on the side of supporting it. So yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's possible. But like Jeff said, there isn't any actual projects on the table right now. And I think that actually, like right now, it almost seemed like Danielle Smith is trying to goad Eby into playing the villain, like to Albertans and to pro fossil fuel supporters. And I think that it's really important right now to avoid getting into sort of like an ideological battle. I'm almost like surprised to hear myself say this, but I think strategically that makes sense, because it's right now, it's one of the broader stroke thing. I think it's really wild that this is coming from Alberta, this very divisive, this more mainstream talk of separatism at a time when Canadian unity has never been stronger from every other province. So I actually think, assuming that BC NDP and most people in BC don't want another oil pipeline, we're actually in a stronger position. And I think we should avoid getting into a trap where it becomes very quickly polarized and sort of like about broader issues that could inflame tensions, because like Jeff said, like it's very kind of early stages on those kinds of discussions.
Yeah, I think that's a great and interesting point, Allie, that maybe Danielle Smith's just looking for someone to fight with, a villain to fight with, given her own. I mean, she's picked a fight with Ottawa on various issues. Maybe she wants Eby to come out against it and then be able to kind of fight with him too.
It could very well be. It's a tricky situation where premiers all across Canada have to simultaneously try to help each other's as neighbors and talk about how we open up interprovincial trade in a way that's beneficial for everyone, while simultaneously advocating to the Prime Minister that we need a little bit more because everyone's dealing with big issues. And it just, so you find things that were very interesting in the way that they even spoke. They were all very careful in what they said, and it's so interesting that even just the seating arrangement of the press conference afterwards was such a big deal that Danielle Smith and David Eby were sitting next to each other, like, get over it.
Yeah.
But
maybe they did it on purpose just to show that, Yeah.
It could very well be. And so, but really, the point of this whole this conference was to show that the West has a little bit more leveraging power right now, and then that'll be helpful in their conversations with the Prime Minister. But some major things were also left out in that opening up the interprovincial trade barriers come with a lot of issues of accreditation for across jurisdictions. Things like something like the BC's talking about in the removal of federal emission caps. Each province has their own position on that, and I don't know if they even came out with a clear path to how they would each talk about it on the federal stage. And so while it was a positioning of listen to us in the West and look, we're all getting along, some big conversations were still left out.
Mm-hmm. There were some things that seemed to make some sense coming out of it, like expanding rail service to the Port of Prince Rupert. There was a brief discussion about maybe doubling that, some type of corridor stretching from Manitoba and the Hudson Bay to the West Coast on energy and interties and things like that. They did find some common ground, I guess, and we'll see if Ottawa supports those.
They found some common ground also on the issue of forestry and forest workers, bringing that as a united front to the Government of Canada. As we know, with most federal governments of a Liberal persuasion, Ontario and Quebec are at the front of the line for everything. You see Prime Minister Carney talking about support for the auto sector. It's good to see this is something Premier Eby raised, but all to their credit, all the premiers got around was you can't forget forestry workers in Western Canada. We need the federal government to play a role in standing up for them in our fight against Trump.
Well, the Premier's in Yellowknife. He's also asked about a joint press conference happening that same day. The UBCM, the Union of BC Municipalities, and the First Nations Leadership Council urging his government to withdraw Bill 15. We talked about that on last week's show, the legislation to fast-track projects. Indigenous leaders say they weren't consulted. It's going to roll back reconciliation. Municipalities upset as well. There was 1 week left in the legislative session. Do we think the Premier pushes Bill 15 through? Should he? And what are the consequences of doing that? Jillian, let's start with you.
I think, Eby really came in, only had half term for his first kind of term as government because he took over from the leadership from John Horgan. And he came in trying to brand himself as a man of action, promising tangible results, but only had 2 years to sort of make that happen. And I think, the results of the election and the discourse around it showed that voters weren't convinced. So I think now he really feels like it's make or break and that he really needs this centralization of powers to make sure that he has big things that he to show for in 3 years' time. So I think that's where he's coming from. It's so hard to predict anything in politics 3 months down the line right now, let alone 3 years. So it's going to be truly fascinating to watch which projects they end up using this legislation for, how the public reacts, how the controversy for each one plays out, and if any kind of, catch fire and if public opinion breaks one way or the other with it. From a policy perspective, the biggest concern for me, and I think will also be an election issue, is, Eby's made all these personal guarantees that it's not going to be used for fossil fuel projects. He's going to work in partnership with First Nations. What if we have a different government in 4 years? And there's no sunset clause on the legislation. He doesn't have an answer for that. What, a John Rustad or another conservative government would do with these centralization of powers that allow them to basically bypass environmental assessments and all other things. So, I think it's impossible to predict. It's going to be fascinating to watch where it goes.
Mm-hmm. And what happens, Allie, if the government does face protests and legal action and that type of thing on this as well? Are they we're supposed to avoid that. That was the point of of some of this government's work on the way it develops legislation. But it looks like we may be heading there anyways.
Well, I mean, fundamentally, the system that they're trying to fix is broken, and that's why they're trying to develop this where they have a little bit more power in order to be able to bypass some of that red tape, right? And so that's the core of it. It's that things aren't working. Let's try to fix it. So I commend the NDP for that. But it is a gamble in that, sure, there could be some litigation after this. It could very well stop some projects. But in the end, 20 years from now, if it ends up paying off and these projects get built and it ends up working out for our economy, then how will we remember David Eby's action here? It's very similar to when Christy Clark started talking about LNG. No one thought that was going to turn into the success story that it is, but she championed it either way. But it was a risk and a gamble that if it didn't, history would remember her as someone who was advocating for a false hope. So it's definitely risky. But to the question of, is this going to pass? There's nothing that's going to prevent it from passing. They have the votes. They
do have the one vote to do it. Jeff, just really briefly on this, and then we'll pick this conversation up in our podcast that I hope you subscribe to as well. But Bill 15.
When governments introduce legislation, you get opposition. Let's be honest, we're a nation of nitpickers. We scrutinize everything. We demand perfection. If it's not there, we oppose it. I think one of the things that has been missed in this whole issue of Bill 15 is the bigger question of how BC climbs out of deficit. With Bill 15, Premier Eby has picked his lane. It's growing the economy, economic development to increase revenues. The other options, and it'd be interesting to see where opponents of the bill and the opposition parties weigh in. You can make service cuts to health and education. You can do public sector layoffs. You can raise taxes on individuals and businesses during an affordability crisis in a time of global economic uncertainty. Eby's made his position clear. I expect he's going to see this bill through to the end. And the real test now, and one thing I would like to see from opponents of the bill is what lane they think BC should pick when it comes to dealing with our fiscal situation.
Yeah, it is an interesting context, that $10 billion structural deficit.
I believe it's 14.
Well, with the carbon tax, it probably is 14. Okay.
Yeah.
Make sure you subscribe to our podcast. We have more discussion about Bill 15, some other issues this week. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the panel. And we will see you next week with all the latest here in BC politics on Political Capital. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.